Johnson's night of regret after signing the law. The ink was still drying, and the room was already empty. Applause had faded, cameras were gone, and silence rushed in. That was when the weight of what he had done finally arrived. To understand Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, we must begin not with ambition, but with aftermath, with a moment after a victory so large it reshaped the nation, and yet carried consequences its author fully understood. Because leadership is often clearest when success no longer feels like triumph. Johnson was a master of power. He knew how to bend institutions, pressure allies, and force outcomes. He believed government could be an engine for justice if driven hard enough. And for a time it worked. Laws passed, barriers fell, history moved. The legislation he signed that day represented decades of struggle. It promised equality where exclusion had been enforced. It challenged systems built to resist change. To many, it was moral progress made permanent. Johnson knew it was necessary. He also knew it would cost him everything else. As president, Johnson had built his authority on coalition and control. He understood Congress. He understood compromise. He understood how fragile alliances really were. And in signing that law, he knowingly shattered the political balance that sustained him. Privately, Johnson was blunt about it. He understood that progress would provoke backlash, that power used for justice would also be used against him. The presidency could move a nation forward, but it could not choose how the nation responded. That night, alone with the consequences, Johnson did not celebrate. He calculated. He anticipated resistance. He saw elections shifting, regions hardening, alliances breaking. The victory was real, so was the loss guaranteed. This was the beginning of Johnson's defining conflict, a president who achieved historic change. Fully aware it would unravel his political future, he had chosen transformation over survival, and that choice would follow him relentlessly. The law had been signed. The cost was just beginning. The consequences arrived faster than even Johnson expected, and they did not ask permission. Support that once felt solid began to fracture almost immediately. Allies grew cautious. Opponents grew energized. The political ground beneath Johnson shifted in ways no amount of force could stabilize. The law had changed the nation's rules. It had also rewritten its alliances. Johnson had always believed power was transactional. Pressure could be applied. Deals could be made. Resistance could be worn down. But this moment was different. The backlash was not procedural. It was emotional, cultural, deeply personal. It could not be negotiated away. Regional loyalties hardened. Former supporters turned distant. Political capital drained rapidly. Johnson watched as a coalition he spent decades building dissolved piece by piece. The presidency, once an engine of momentum, became a shield against rising hostility. At the same time, another pressure intensified. Conflict abroad demanded attention. Resources were stretched. Authority was divided. Johnson felt trapped between unfinished justice at home and escalating danger overseas. Every decision now carried compounded risk. Privately, regret deepened, not for the law itself, but for the timing and cost. Johnson understood that progress rarely arrives cleanly, but he also knew that his ability to manage what came next was eroding. Power spent on transformation was power no longer available for containment. The emotional conflict sharpened here. Johnson believed history would remember the law as necessary, but he also believed history would forget what it took to pass it. The nights grew longer, the pressure heavier, the presidency lonelier. Victory had delivered consequence, and consequence demanded endurance Johnson was running out of. The law stood firm. The ground beneath it did not. The strain reached its peak when regret met reality, and power could no longer absorb the cost. As opposition hardened, Johnson felt the presidency narrowing around him. Every initiative faced resistance. Every proposal reopened old wounds. The law that defined his moral legacy now overshadowed everything else he attempted. Success had become a ceiling rather than a foundation. Public confidence eroded as multiple crises converged. Protests filled streets. Trust in institutions weakened. Abroad, war escalated, draining attention and authority. Johnson was no longer shaping events. He was reacting to them. try to hold together a presidency stretched beyond endurance. Privately, the regret sharpened, not regret for advancing justice, but for the isolation produced. Johnson had believed his mastery of power could manage backlash. He had underestimated how deeply the nation would resist change. Pressure, once his greatest tool, now felt blunt and ineffective. Advisors warned him to recalibrate, to soften rhetoric, to delay further reforms. But Johnson understood the paradox. Retreat would not restore support. It would only cheapen the sacrifice already made. The choice that won history's approval had permanently cost him political oxygen. This was the emotional zenith of his story. A leader who achieved transformative success realized it had closed more doors than it opened. The presidency had delivered justice, but at the price of authority. Johnson felt trapped inside his own accomplishment. The man who once dominated rooms now felt unheard. The strategist who once bent systems now faced resistance that could not be moved. Regret did not undo the law. It only deepened the loneliness that followed it. The resolution came with withdrawal, not reversal. Johnson chose not to seek another term, understanding that his presidency had reached its limit. The law he signed remained. The backlash continued, and the cost was accepted rather than contested. He did not renounce the decision. He absorbed its consequence. In leaving, Johnson revealed the depth of his regret and resolve. He believed justice demanded sacrifice. He had made that sacrifice knowingly. The presidency, in his view, existed to move the nation forward, not to protect the person occupying the office. History often divides Johnson's legacy. Triumph at home, turmoil abroad, but his night of regret reveals something deeper. The understanding that power used for moral transformation does not guarantee stability. It guarantees resistance. Johnson's story matters because it shows that leadership is not about avoiding consequence. It is about choosing which consequences you are willing to carry. He chose justice over unity, knowing unity built on injustice was temporary. The presidency survived because he accepted loss rather than compromise the law. His regret was not for the outcome, but for the toll it took on his ability to continue leading. Some victories end presidencies. Others define them. Johnson's did both. What Johnson's night of regret also reveals is something about the particular loneliness of political foresight. Johnson was not surprised by what followed the signing. He had predicted it with precision. He understood the electoral geography. He knew which coalitions would fracture, which regions would harden, which former allies would quietly distance themselves. He knew because he had spent his entire career studying exactly these dynamics. His mastery of the Senate had been built on this kind of knowledge, the ability to see, in advance, how power would respond to pressure. And he saw clearly that this particular pressure would cost him more than anything else he could have done. That knowledge did not change his decision. It deepened his solitude, because knowing the cost in advance is not the same as being ready to pay it. You can understand, intellectually and completely, that a choice will isolate you, and still feel the isolation fully when it arrives. Johnson felt it fully. The loneliness of a man who has done what he believed was right, in full knowledge of what would cost him, and who must now live inside the consequences he predicted. That loneliness is different from the loneliness of the person who is surprised by consequences. It is more precise, more inescapable. There is no comfort in, "I didn't know." There is only the knowledge that you knew and chose anyway, and must continue choosing, because the alternative is to have known the cost and paid it for nothing, which would be worse than any political isolation. This is what Johnson's night captures. Not regret in the ordinary sense of wishing he had decided differently, but regret in the form of full consciousness about the price of a decision he would make again. The awareness that moral clarity does not protect you from its consequences. That doing the right thing, when the right thing is genuinely costly, produces exactly as much pain as you would predict. And that leaders who act with that awareness, who pay the price they foresaw, in full, without retreat, are demonstrating a form of integrity that history is slow to recognize and often quick to punish. Johnson's story is not a tragedy in the sense of man undone by his flaws. It is a tragedy in a different sense. The sense of man who saw clearly, chose bravely, and paid completely for something that outlasted him and deserved to. Some victories end presidencies. Others define them. Johnson's did both. Johnson